Well, let's talk about another thing that several people have sent in questions about. Jim, your thoughts on word that came out that on, I believe, December 30th, the passing of Johnny Powers.
That Johnny Powers is probably, I would say, the biggest name in wrestling of the 60s and 70s that I not only never saw in person, I've never met to this day, but I never even until the last few years, and especially when he just passed away and people put some links up of his matches, never even saw him. And at the same time, he was in a pretty important and pivotal place for quite a number of things in wrestling in the Buffalo territory. And that was where, he pretty much stayed for most of his career. But, how much have you seen of Johnny Powers actually in the ring?
Well, the first clip, and for many years the only clip I saw, was the actual Riot video, which isn't a fair representation of really much.
Right.
Especially considering he was a babyface for so much of his run.
And we should explain that the Riot we've talked about in Cleveland, Ohio with Ox Baker and Ernie Ladd, Johnny Powers was the third guy in there. And it was an angle where Powers had just switched heel. And that's why, one of the biggest reasons why the people were so fucking mad was that Ernie Ladd was a big babyface at the time. And so had Powers been, and then they did that angle and got out of hand.
But not too much. I'm trying to think of the specific examples. I know I've seen some stuff from Japan that was even filmed in the States with him, especially, Inoki beating him for the NWF title. But not too much, and a lot of that's because there isn't too much. Despite Pedro Martinez eventually having a major catalog of footage he acquired, he didn't have too much NWF stuff.
There's a few things from the IWA, and I saw a clip,
That's
I think
right.
PW Insider put it up, a clip from the old Buffalo days in the 60s when he was young and had the bleach blonde hair. But the point is...
Before the wig.
Yeah. Power, he was a guy who got in the business, and I've read an interview that he did with Scott Teal, I believe it was a long time ago. It's been published in one of Scott's books. But Powers was a guy who got in the business. He had good size and a good aptitude for what the business was about, and he pursued pretty quickly the business end. He got over as a local area guy in the Buffalo, Cleveland territory early on for Pedro Martinez, the promoter. And by the end of the 60s, he was booking for Martinez, and he was a figure in the office there in that territory, as well as being the guy that was pushed on top most of the time as a babyface, sometimes as a heel. As a booker, he did people may not remember this now, but there was a Super Bowl of wrestling done in the Cleveland Municipal Stadium back in 1972, and the NWF, National Wrestling Federation, was the promotion there in that area. They were in between the Sheik in Michigan and Vince Sr. in the Northeast, and they were right up, above Bruiser in Indiana and the Carolinas and Crockett. And that territory was what later was sold to Antonio Inoki in 73, so that he bought his own American World Heavyweight title, because they had their own world title, so that he could be a star in America for the Japanese press. But the Super Bowl show in Cleveland at the stadium, they brought in a shitload of talent. I think, who was it? Was it, oh, God damn it. Was it Valentine and Powers on top for the NWF title?
Oh, I was going to say Ernie Ladd, but maybe.
It may have been Ernie Ladd, but nevertheless. But they had 3 rings going at the same time for the earlier matches because they had so many matches, and that had to be distracting as fuck. But the thing is, and it didn't draw that big of a house at that time, that the territory had been in better shape, and that big hot shot type of thing, didn't do it. So, you see the pictures, there's a lot of empty seats. I've been in that stadium for a wrestling event, and it's big, but they said the Super Bowl may have done 12,000 people or something like that. And Now for Cleveland, 12,000 people, that's a big deal, and they ran the town regularly, but back then it was considered a flop. But that's the thing. Powers was in the office. He was the booker. He was partners with Martinez, and he's the one that put Inoki over when Inoki bought the territory, which, of course, that was the beginning of the end for wrestling in Cleveland and Buffalo being different than the WWF, because Inoki didn't care about running Cleveland and Buffalo. He wanted an American world title and to be the champion of a promotion. So what, they were done by the next year, right? As far as a separate territory.
It didn't last too much longer after the Inoki thing, and by 75 they were getting things together with Einhorn.
Yeah, and Johnny Powers was involved in that with the original IWA formation that he got involved with. And when Einhorn was ready to get out, then Powers, I'm not going to give all the details this correctly, but Powers ended up with probably a backer or two taking the thing over and trying to make the IWA a strictly Carolinas-based promotion and run opposition to Crockett. And that didn't work out very well, but it bought the IWA, another year and a half or so, until 77, 78. But he was always trying to be involved in an office, always trying to be involved in the booking and the matchmaking. He seemed to be a business-oriented guy that knew that was where you made all the money in wrestling. So, and since then, early 80s, he was done as a wrestler. There was, I'm sure he tried to probably put together a few things, but there wasn't a lot of places to go. I wonder if he made a lot of friends with always being involved in the office and trying to do some of those things and run opposition to Crockett and etc. But he didn't do any real fan fests or autograph shows or whatever, even in the last 10 or 20 years when everybody has. So he's one of those guys that if you didn't study the history of the wrestling territories, you would not know Johnny Powers, but he was, for a 20-year period, figured in pretty heavily in what went on.
If you were a kid who grew up in Cleveland, he was the biggest wrestling star.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, at one point in the late 60s, their television show was Championship Wrestling with Johnny Powers, right? That was the title of it. So it's an example of, in the territory days, for the people in that particular area who had only seen the television geared toward them, a guy that somebody in another part of the country had never heard of before could be viewed as the greatest wrestler in the world. And that happened more than once in a variety of places. Nobody could convince anybody in Amarillo, Texas, that Dory Funk Sr. wasn't the toughest guy in the history of the world. But somebody in Washington State may have never fucking heard of him before. But there you go. Rest in peace, Johnny Powers and your power lock.